Hello and welcome to the Green Innovation Group podcast. As you may know, we are on a mission to decarbonize the healthcare industry. And the reason why we want to do this is, first of all, it's the most important mission in the history of mankind to achieve drawdown. Drawdown is the point in time where we as a human species emit fewer greenhouse gases into the atmosphere than we take out of it. And decarbonizing healthcare is a major step in achieving that mission. Right now, the healthcare sector is emitting just around 6% of all global emissions. However, they are 55% less carbon effective compared to the automotive industry when we're looking at the revenue generation. So this is an area that calls for urgent action and for sharp minds to mobilize in order to address this challenge. And that's why we're here. So in today's episode, I am interviewing my co-founder in Green Innovation Group, Joachim Frederik, about the low-hanging fruits for the green transition, scope 1, 2, and 3 for pharmaceutical and MedTech companies, as well as the low-hanging fruits in order to take part in the green transition. So we're looking at an industry that's heavily regulated, that's driven by having a patient focus, and that is facing some quite complex challenges in order to become decarbonized. And I hope that you will take something away from this, particularly if you're inspired to actually change something. Without further ado, I look forward to hearing your feedback and your comments. This is my conversation with Joachim. Cheers. Welcome, Joachim.
Thank you.
Today we're going to have a conversation about some of the challenges that we've seen in decarbonizing healthcare. And one of the things that have come up in conversations many times between the two of us is the importance behind the decarbonization of the healthcare industry and the healthcare sector at large. And you've been working on a very wide range of different projects. You've met a very wide range of different companies, both in the pharmaceutical sector, in the MedTech sector, and from the public sector. So you have a pretty holistic understanding of the problem. So just to kick things off, why do you find this agenda so important?
I find it so important, the decarbonization of the whole globe, that I actually believe it's the single most important mission of mankind to achieve drawdown, the point in time where we pull more CO2 out of the atmosphere than we put in. And if we agree on that premise, that that's the most important mission for mankind, then we have to look at everything. And a big part of that, a surprisingly big part of that, is the healthcare industry. Some estimates put it at around 6% of total emissions. What is 6%? Well, it's actually more than the aviation industry and the shipping industry.
And we've been pointing fingers at those two, so that should make up some numbers.
But we're not really talking about the healthcare industry, and it's only going to grow. We have an increasing population. We have a population that's getting older, and we also have an increase in wealth, in economic resources, and we can see that wealthier countries spend relatively more money on healthcare.
Mm-hmm. So there's kind of a very big emitter here that we're not talking about that much. I saw a statistic yesterday that said that if SUVs were a nation, they would be the 5th biggest emitter in the world. Mm-hmm. So how come you don't work with SUVs, decarbonizing the SUVs?
Well, there's a bunch of different reasons. I mean, you were there, not 3,000 years ago, but seven years ago when we started Green Innovation Group, and we've been working in a range of industries. But at some point, we really had to ask ourselves the question, where can we make the most difference, the biggest difference? And I think by far the best answer is the healthcare industry, for a number of different reasons. First of all, it's a big emitter, so it's a big problem. So it needs to be solved. And as you mentioned, it's not in focus. And I'll get back to that, but we're seeing that changing rapidly now. But it's not been a topic at all. And then it's a very complex industry. And we haven't, some by chance, some by intention, to do quite a bit of projects in the healthcare industry, which also put us in a position to understand this complex industry. an industry that's very regulated, that has some lock-in effects, that makes changes hard sometimes on long timelines, and that also has a very specific frame that you cannot compromise on, that at the end of the day you need to provide solid care for the end patient. Care that is safe, that is efficient, and that is within a reasonable cost frame so that we can cover the whole population. And it's been an absolute joy to make that focus, because the willingness is growing and the potential is super vast. But it also needs to happen. It needs to happen urgently.
And I want to sort of double click on this concept that when we're looking at the healthcare industry, safety for the patient is of course a key focus. Efficiency of the treatment you develop is a key focus, and the cost is the third biggest priority. So how do you see decarbonization claiming a spot in that top three? Because those seem to be non-negotiable, right?
Yeah, and in a large sense they are, and it's not just a random top three. This was actually a survey from a research study among C-level executives in the pharma and healthcare industry, and the way I see it, there are a couple of different things, and it's important to understand that things are moving very, very rapidly right now. I heard one executive put it very nicely that 12 months ago this wasn't even on his radar. Now it's a focus area. 12 months from now it's going to be key. So we're also seeing a very, very massive change, a wave coming where this cannot be ignored. And there's a bunch of reasons why it can't be ignored. First of all, is the regulation. That that's a deep rabbit hole, but the regulations are already there or they are on the horizon, especially in an EU context. With the EU taxonomy, extended supplier responsibility, it's very, very, very likely that most countries will have a carbon tax, which is then a combination of you have regulation pushing, but you also have cost pushing. And we're seeing more and more healthcare systems put this into their procurement targets, because they have their own sustainability targets. They are now planting flags as well, joining science-based target initiatives and others, other frameworks saying that by 2050, by 2040, we want to be carbon net zero. And most of the emissions of a healthcare system, hospitals and other things, lies outside of the system. So that naturally creates a massive pressure down for the sub-suppliers. And in this case, especially pharmaceutical companies, MedTech companies, that they simply cannot ignore, because it's going to be put in tender requirements. So it's three different angles that the pharma and medtech companies, they need to comply with regulation. They also need to hit their own sustainability targets in order to do this. But I think perhaps most importantly, and still quite undervalued, is that this is going to be absolutely key for their business. In the future, you are not going to be able to maintain your market share to sell your actual products if you are not sustainable, because then you're not going to get through the procurement departments. There will be exceptions, breakthrough drugs, some kind of very specific cancer where there's only 2 different treatments on the market. Of course those treatments will get through. But that's not the case for most treatments, for most drugs, for most devices. There are many suppliers, and the greener suppliers who can still deliver efficient and safe cares will be chosen. And
I think you're latching on to one of the key points here, that there's future-proofing your business. Are you going to win or to lose market shares by joining or choosing not to join the green transition? I see that as a very real challenge, and I also see it as something that the clients that we speak to, they recognize this premise.
Yeah, they do.
But then in the projects that you've been part of, and the projects that you haven't been part of, or the frustrations that have led us to become part of projects, what are the reasons why this fails? How come it's not already there?
That's a very, very good question. So, first of all, the conditions that I lined up before, the safety and efficiency and being patient-centric, at the end of the day, the drug or the treatment has to get out to the patient. That creates a very, very operations-focused organizations. And that combined with the regulation, and they're usually also quite large size of these companies, means that change in general is hard. And change in general takes time. But when we're talking about sustainability, there's a lot of things that is not so different, but just seems different. But there are also part of the things where we need to work in radically new, different ways. And the companies at the forefront, especially in Northern Europe, they're doing this. They've been doing this for a while. So I think it's also important to say that it depends very much on the lens and the scope that you put in. Because, I mean, the new key thing is that it needs to go in and be part of the core business. That if almost any pharma and MedTech company have done a lot of green initiatives already by accident or because it was good business, they have been doing energy efficiency projects for a long time. They've been optimizing their supply chain. They have, in some cases, tried to remove material from devices because it's a cost. And a lot of these initiatives have had good green side effects. But most of the time, it has either fallen into one of two categories, I would say, maybe three. One is I like to call the CSR trap, which was the dominant way to go up through the 90s and the zeros for some, even the 10s for some. It's still kind of the case that there was an understanding there's something more that's important than just the business and just the patients. We also need to be part of society and behave differently. So what we do is that we will have 1 or 2 FTEs that puts out a report once a year that says we're doing something nice and we need to do a little bit more over here, but we're basically all right.
We're good people.
We are good people. We are good people, and you should be proud to work for us. And keep in mind that that is 1 or 2 FTEs in a 10,000, 50,000 FTE organization. Okay, it's not a priority. It's a marketing thing. But in those CSR years, there was still a lot of good things going on. But it was either shoehorned in with the EHS, environmental health and safety, where there are, of course, there were still regulations to live up to what you could do and could not do with your wastewater. And if people got hurt on sites or in the factories, it's bad for business, it's bad for people, and you're not going to get your standards and certifications. So a lot of good things happened here, but it was never a key focus. It was always a side thing. And then something major happened and it's still happening, but for the front movers maybe like 5 years ago, that suddenly this had to be part of your top 3 at sea level, at least in the way that you communicate it. And that brings us to what is the status today for a lot of companies. That a lot of pharma and MedTech companies today are in a place where they have put down ambitious goals. Some of them are for 2050. Personally, I think that's quite late. given that we have a Paris Agreement with some very serious consequences in 2030 if that agreement is not met. Some have put 2030 goals. Either way, there's planted a flag out there. The CEO or the board of directors have been out saying we need to be carbon neutral or some variant of that in that timeline. A lot at least, pharma and MedTech companies have gone quite far in scope 2 as well.
Maybe you can just roll back a little bit and explain what are the scopes and why are they relevant?
Yeah. So scope 1, 2 and 3 is a way to divide where the CO2 emissions come from, who is responsible for what, created by the greenhouse gas protocol, which is a framework we can talk about another time from the World Resource Institute. Basically what it means is that scope 1 is everything that is inside your own organization, your household basically. If you're a pharmaceutical company, that is it. Your factories, your fleet and so on. Scope 2 is the energy that you're consuming and buying from the outside, be that electricity or gas or heating, cooling. And scope 3 is everything that's still related to you in the supply chain, both upstream and downstream. So it's both all of your suppliers, but it's also your distribution network.
So now we've touched upon the challenge of wrestling the scope 3 beast, which is something we can be highly skeptical that's actually solved by someone, which maybe again plays back into a key point that we're in such an immature stage of this journey that we also kind of have to celebrate everyone who's trying, even though accuracy is not obtained. On the other hand, we're also seeing that everything in scope 2, primarily purchasing clean energy for consumption on site, is relatively easily, and it's a consolidated commoditized market where you can go out and purchase what you need in order to be compliant with your goals and your ambitions in scope 2. But if you were a senior vice president or vice president in a major pharmaceutical and medtech company, and you were looking at this sort of garden of solutions, and clean energy is already there, that's a low-hanging fruit that has been harvested. What are the remaining low-hanging fruits that are still ripe for the picking, as you've been observing this in projects?
Well, the good thing is there's still a lot of low-hanging fruits. The big ones, of course, all tie into what are the biggest emitters globally, because they will be relatively the same. If I were an executive in a pharma company or medtech company, I would definitely look into stuff like, are we using plant-based food and beverages everywhere we can? In the cantina. Maybe even not tell anyone that it's just a lasagna and 80% of the meat in the lasagna is not meat. It's lentils or something else. Same for milk consumption at the coffee stands. Huge savings, high quality, very little change for employees. Perhaps even better if it goes a bit under the radar. Changing the large vehicle fleets. Most pharma and medtech companies have a lot of area sales representatives that go out and meet general practitioners, hospitals, others. And even though they're starting to use Zoom more and more, which is another great low-hanging fruit, electrifying that vehicle fleet is massive. And it's not a new way of working. I mean, you're used to having leasing contracts, you're used to buying these kind of assets, and the quality is super much there. It's going to be a great experience for everyone who has to drive an electric car. Most likely they're going to look cooler. And in a very near future, they're going to look stupid if they don't come in a green car. In some places, they're already going to look stupid now. If they drive up in that big diesel SUV to sell to a green procurement department. Then, I mean, we talked about scope 2 and where you buy your energy from. But the fact is that the best energy is the one that we don't use. So even though you buy your energy green, there's still a lot of low-hanging fruits in energy projects. The business cases are very good, especially now with energy prices being high, but also before. And all the great engineering heads and even the finance people in the pharma and MedTech companies, they're used to doing these kind of projects. And the payback times are good and it's relatively understandable. So I would turn that up a lot. In parallel to that, cooling is a major emitter, both in office buildings, but especially also in the production. So fine-tuning all your HVAC is a really low-hanging fruit where there are so many good business cases. Whether that is introducing ranges, so you don't just cool an office space to 22 degrees all the time, but it can be between 20 and 25 before you start spending energy on manipulating the temperature. Can also be that in a lot of warehouses and production facilities, we just set one temperature for the whole place, rather than saying, okay, over here we need more cooling, over here we don't need so much cooling. Or also there's a lot of cases where we will just say, okay, we need to be prepared for the worst case scenario, for the hottest summer day. So that is the cooling standard. But most of the year is not the hottest summer day. So that is a great way to use. And all of these examples I just mentioned, they're very low-hanging fruit. So, the solutions are there in the market. The business cases are, often there will be cost savings, or in the case of electrifying the fleet, it will be comparable for personal transport, at least. Doing more stuff in teams, flying less, another incredible one. And it's actually, that's a gift from COVID, it's become second nature.
So yesterday we had an interesting situation that came up in a conversation with an executive from a global MedTech company. And I was talking to her about this whole working remote and moving the sales force more into teams due to COVID restrictions.
Microsoft Teams.
Yeah, Microsoft Teams. And I asked her, well, it's also peculiar because if I were an executive and I had the choice between having my sales staff on the road in a car or in front of a client via Microsoft Teams, I know what I would pick as an executive in driving the commercial side, that it just makes a lot of sense to optimize the time usage as well from a sort of more cynical business standpoint. And I think this ties quite neatly into another one of the horses you usually like to beat, that it has to have a connection to the business case. Now we've looked at all of the low-hanging fruits for sort of optimizing on Scope 2 emissions. If we had to say, okay, what is the low-hanging fruit that is also closely related to the commercial side of things, the sort of pure strict business driving sales, what do you see as the main potential here?
That's a great question. I would say that the great potential there is preparing your whole organization, and especially commercial, of course, to be able to operate and win in a procurement environment where being green, being sustainable is a massive a massive part of whether you're going to win a tender or not. So what does that actually mean? It means that your salespeople need to be conversational and have a basic literacy in talking about circularity, CO2 emissions, LCA analysis, because they have to help their customers in the procurement departments meet their goals. So there's a massive capacity building that needs to happen. But they also need to be equipped with the data on their products in order to have these conversations at a serious level, in order to compete in the tenders and write these things in. So there's a skill gap that needs to be changed. and there's a data gap that needs to be changed. That's in the here and now, just competing with the products that we have. Then I think it's key that, and this is very hard in a large corporate organization, that direct conversations need to happen between the different departments, because we have so long tie-in effects from, it's less in MedTech than it is in pharma, but the lead times between something being developed in R&D, going through clinical trials, getting approved by the FDA, being put into production, and finally getting into the market are very long. So that means that the factories that we are going to build for the stuff that's in clinical now, that's going to be sold by the sales people out there, all that is a balancing act of tying those things in together. And I think I would make a big mark on also revisiting my portfolio and say, okay, for the products we have on the market, are there any ways to retrofit these or optimize these so that they become more carbon efficient for the existing ones, but also to start having the discussion in the clinical departments, in R&D, in the dialogues that are between R&D and production and so on, because everybody needs to work together in the end for this. But for the forefront commercial, it's a data gap and it's a skill gap for the average salesman on the ground.
Cool, thanks a lot. So, in summary, we're looking at an industry that's incredibly polluting, very complex, regulation-driven, having long lead times from the idea conception to going to market. We have patient concerns that dictate everything we do. It needs to be safe, it needs to be efficient, it needs to be cost-effective, and then it has to comply with greenhouse gas protocol. In order to address the need for decarbonization in the healthcare industry, we've seen a lot of the low-hanging fruits being picked. The change into to procuring green energy is definitely happening and on the rise, and companies are now figuring out ways of organizing within Scope 1 and Scope 3 to orient themselves towards decarbonization. However, some of the problems that we're seeing is still developing the basic literacy in the organizations, that there may be an executive wish to go green or to have declared targets, but most of the staff is still hitting a stumbling block when they're confronted with random acronyms like GHG protocol, SBTi, LCAs, MDR, regulatory medical device regulations, etc. And the interesting thing here is that there's really a potential lever for change by providing this literacy in order to make sure that you can maintain your market shares in a market that is in a higher and higher degree demanding green solutions, or as a bare minimum demanding transparency on the emissions associated to the products.
Yeah. And it's not tomorrow, it's today. National healthcare system in UK, one of the largest procurers of healthcare in the whole world. I mean, they have set targets. The regions in Denmark, they have set targets. More and more of the healthcare systems in the US are setting targets. So even though it's early days, I have no doubt that if we had this conversation in just a couple of years, and that's a short time frame in pharma at least, maybe not MedTech, everyone is going to have targets. And every procurement department will be working with this.
Yeah, it's going to become a license to operate.
Definitely.
Thank you so much for sharing your thoughts, Joachim. Thank you so much for listening. We always appreciate your feedback. We also highly appreciate if you comment and share, or if you bring to us a wish list. What could be even better? What did you like about the show? Who would you like for us to interview? What would you like to educate yourself on in the realm of decarbonizing healthcare? That's the only topic we work with. basically. Sometimes we have a few strays. But at the end of the day, we have a lot of knowledge in our heads, and we're here to share it with you, because this is the most important mission in the history of mankind, achieving drawdown. Our little niche of that is to help decarbonizing healthcare. Thank you so much.